Okay, so my presentation is on a mini review that is by Lynn S. Alder, and it's on the ecological significance of toxic nectar. So the general function of nectar in plants is to attract pollinators and or enemies of herbivores, or both. And these both constitute examples of mutualism. And so a little bit about how nectar secretion works. Nectar is secreted in glands known as nectaries, and these may be found on the floral tissues, such as the calyx, the corolla, the stamen, the carpels, also known as the pistils, or on extrafloral tissues. However, the review that I looked at only focused on floral nectaries. And so these nectaries are connected to components of the plant's vascular system, either the phloem or both the xylem and the phloem. And so the difference between the xylem and the phloem is in this diagram here, and the xylem is responsible for transporting water and minerals. There are no end walls between the cells. Transportation is only going one way, and the cells surrounding the xylem are not living. For the phloem, let me minimize that. The phloem is transporting organic molecules. It does possess end walls. It exhibits two-way movement, and the cells are living and they need support. And here are some examples of nectaries within a flower. Here you can see nectar being secreted from the bud, nectar being secreted from the petals in this case. Here's another example of a nectary, and another example of a nectary is here. Nectar is being secreted at the base of the flower. And here's a photo demonstrating the difference between floral nectaries and extrafloral nectaries. So here, this is a nectary within the flower. Here, this is towards the end of a leaf. And then this photo is just showing the difference between the xylem and the phloem in a pictomicrograph, which I thought looked pretty neat. And so how is nectar secreted? From the phloem, pre-nectar will enter the parenchymatous cells of the nectaries by 4 pathways. And this includes entry through the apoplast, and this is through the cell wall. And you can see this here with this orange line going through the cell wall. It may also be through endocytosis or exocytosis, which involves the transport of vesicles containing the compounds within the pre-nectar. And this would occur through here. And it could also occur through the plasmodesmata, which are cellular junctions. And the final way that they can be transported is through molecular transport across the plasmalemma, also known as plasma membrane, or passage through the cell walls. And this would involve the pre-nectar compounds attaching themselves to other molecules that are already being transported through the plasma membrane and or cell wall in a co-transport-like fashion. And it was found, though, that the transport of pre-nectar primarily occurs through the symplastic pathway, which is demonstrated with this blue here. And so that makes the plasmodesmata especially important in its transport. And so nectar secretion, once inside of the secretory cells of the nectar can be secreted in 2 ways. It can either be through eccrine secretion, which involves active transport, so it requires energy, and this is as opposed to passive diffusion. Or it could be through granulocrine secretion, and this is where the membranes of the vesicles fuse with the plant's plasmalemma and allow them to pass through. Nectar is composed of 90% sugar by dry weight, and the other 10% is composed of a combination of amino acids, lipids, antioxidants, mineral ions, and secondary compounds. And nectar composition varies very widely between plant species, and it can actually even vary within a single plant species within the different types of nectaries. So the floral nectaries could be secreting an entirely different type of nectar than, say, the extrafloral nectaries. And it was found that different pollinators have been correlated to specific sugar ratios and amino acid compositions within this nectar. And this suggests that pollinators are selecting for and are attracted to certain kinds of tastes of nectar that's dependent on the molecular composition of that nectar. And so why does nectar composition vary between different plant species? Well, it can be explained in 2 ways that are not necessarily mutually exclusive. it could be that the secretory processes of the nectaries controls the chemical composition of the nectar, and this varies between different plant species. Or it could be that the constituents of the nectar are reflecting the chemical composition of the phloem, and the phloem composition is what varies between the plant species. Or it could be both occurring at the same time. And so on to the point of the review, toxic nectar. The general definition of toxic nectar is that it deters or poisons floral visitors due to the presence of toxic secondary compounds. However, it's important to keep in mind when discussing toxic nectar that the secondary compounds are not necessarily always toxic, and nectar that deters one floral visitor may not necessarily deter others. And finally, secondary compounds may have multiple roles and interactions within the plant that it could occur synergistically. And so many studies have demonstrated that certain nectars are toxic or deterrent to animals. However, within a lot of these studies, they didn't actually identify the compounds that were responsible for this change in behavior. And most of these focus on honeybees or humans that were poisoned by honey that was made from a specific nectar from a specific plant. And oftentimes these studies describe bee death or narcosis following the floral visits. And here is a table showing the different species and the effect and behavior that they had on the animals. And so here the effects that are listed are that they were toxic to bees, toxic to honeybees. One of them was lethal to honeybee larvae, another deterred ants, another, which I thought was interesting, the honey ended up tasting bitter to humans and it induced nausea. And then still others, you have ones that are toxic to both bees and other insects. And they actually list a solanaceous plant here, Solanum nigrum, and that was found to have a toxic effect on bees. And so other studies actually have identified the secondary compounds that are resulting in the toxicity that occurred within the nectar. However, these studies failed to test the effects of those compounds on the floral visitors. So it's not known if the compounds are occurring in concentrations large enough to induce any ecological effects. However, it has been demonstrated that alkaloids, phenolics, and non-protein amino acids are commonly present in nectar. And here I have listed a bunch of alkaloids and the plants that they're derived from. So some of the more notable ones, at least ones that I recognize, were morphine, nicotine, and caffeine. And so all of those are examples of alkaloids which result in toxicity in some animals, not all. And so here is a list of the secondary compounds that were found to result in toxicity and the plants that they were associated with. However, if you note, this table is not listing any animal behaviors associated with contact with these secondary compounds. But there actually have been studies that have established a definitive link between nectar chemistry and toxicity. And this is shown in this table here. We have the species, the family, what secondary compound is causing the toxicity, and the effect that it had on honeybees. And so the author went through a bunch of different papers and was able to summarize the effects that were found. And so some of them deterred honeybees, some of them deterred ants or not, some of them deterred ants and a butterfly. Some had honey that were toxic to humans, some were toxic to bees, etc. And so why does toxic nectar occur? If, the point of it is to have this mutualistic, relationship, why would there be toxic nectar? The short answer is that it's not fully understood. However, there are several hypotheses that have been proposed by various authors, and these include the Pollinator Fidelity Hypothesis, the Nectar Robber Hypothesis, the Drunken Pollinator Hypothesis, the Antimicrobial Hypothesis, the Pleiotropy Hypothesis, which is also a consequence of defense, and others that don't specifically have a name. And so this first hypothesis I'm going to talk about is the Pollinator Fidelity Hypothesis. And this was first identified by Baker and Baker in 1975. And it was found that bees are more resistant to alkaloids than adult Lepidoptera. And so higher concentrations of the alkaloids would thus encourage pollination by specialist bees rather than ledopterans, who would deliver a less interspecific pollen. Because the ledopterans are considered flower inconstant, meaning these moths and butterflies are visiting a lot of different types of flowers and picking up a lot of different types of pollen, as opposed to specialist bees who are only visiting a single type of flower. And so in this hypothesis, the toxic nectar is analogous to floral structures that require pollinator specialization, for example, a closed corolla, which would thus deter generalist pollinators and encourage specialist pollinators. However, there is no clear support for this hypothesis. The next hypothesis is the nectar robber hypothesis. This was proposed by Jansen and Baker, and it states that toxic nectar deters nectar robbery in the tropics. And so this is applicable to other regions aside from the tropics, but when this hypothesis was first proposed, the research that they were doing was located in the tropics. And it's similar to the pollinator fidelity hypothesis in that both of them involve the deterrence of undesirable visitors. But if nectar is decreasing, if nectar robbery is decreasing plant fitness, then having toxic nectar to deter those robbers would confer a selective advantage to the plant. However, nectar robbery is not usually harmful to the plant, and so more testing is needed to determine if this hypothesis is legitimate or not. And here, the basis of nectar robbery is basically the insects are coming into contact with the nectar, but they are not coming into contact with the reproductive structures of the flower. And so they're taking the nectar without any pollination, and so the plants are not fertilized. And so here you can see a bee just kind of stabbing its way through the flower. Here you can see an ant who's chewed its way into the flower, but they're not contacting any of the reproductive structures at the base of the flower. Next is the drunken pollinator hypothesis. And this is centered around two types of orchids known as Epipactis purpurata and Epipactis helleborni. This is purpurata, this is helleborni. And the toxic nectar of these orchid species is due to the presence of ethanol that is produced by microorganisms infecting the nectar. And the microorganisms can either come from the air or they may be transferred by wasp pollinators. And when wasps drank the nectar, they became sluggish and appeared intoxicated. And a result of this intoxication was that they groomed themselves less for pollinia. And you can see the pollinia demonstrated here on the legs of this wasp. And those are basically large masses of pollen grains that are transferred as a single unit, and they're common in orchids. And so these pollinia may easily over-encumber the wasps due to their large size. And so usually, under normal circumstances, the wasps will remove them to lessen the load that they're carrying while in flight. However, since they are intoxicated, they are not removing this pollen. And this change in behavior could improve pollen transfer as less pollen is being removed by the wasps and may therefore be transferred to other plants more often. Some other systems have exhibited evidence of this hypothesis as well. For example, bees appeared to be intoxicated following visits to Eclipsis flowers. This is known as milkweed commonly. And though a lot of these occurrences actually ended up in bee death, so it's not necessarily beneficial in other systems. The next hypothesis is the antimicrobial hypothesis. This was proposed by Hagler and Buckman in 1993, and it suggests that the phenolics found in nectar could be antimicrobial. And this is thought to be due to the high sugar and nutrient content of nectar, which makes it susceptible to microbial degradation. Many plants contain phenolics in their nectar, not all, but many. And it has been found that the percentage of plant species whose nectar contain the phenolics increase with decreasing latitude. So in other words, the further south you're going, the more plants have nectar with phenolic constituents. And the theory behind this is that as you go further south, microbial diversity increases. So there's a greater array of microbes that could potentially infect the nectar and cause degradation. And so these phenolics are thought to combat that. The next hypothesis is the phytropy hypothesis. This states actually that toxic nectar provides no fitness advantage to the plant at all. and instead is a consequence of pleiotropic constraints. So in other words, it could have resulted from a pleiotropic effect of other traits that are currently being selected for and are beneficial to the plant, such as herbivore resistance. So those secondary compounds have an effect on herbivore resistance and are consequently being transmitted into the nectar as well. Or it could be a pleiotropic effect resulting from the plant's evolutionary history. So the toxic nectar may no longer be selected for or adaptive to the plant, but it was adaptive at one point and the plant just never got rid of the trait. And here's just an example of what pleiotropy is. You have a gene affecting multiple phenotypes, or a single gene affecting multiple phenotypes. And then I just want to kind of wrap up with a couple of examples so you guys can kind of see some of the flowers that have toxic nectar. And these examples are not necessarily related to herbivore resistance. And so here we have Lathria clandestina, also known as purple toothwort, and its nectar contains ammonia. And it's thought that the presence of ammonia could be due to the enzymatic degradation of amino acids within this plant. And here we have onion plants, and their nectar has a very high level of potassium, and this consequently repels bees. Although I will say, I've seen these plants, and I've also seen bees on these plants. So while it repels bees, it doesn't necessarily always deter them. In conclusion, the phenomenon of toxic nectar is poorly understood. And despite the fact that there are several hypotheses suggesting that toxic nectar has an adaptive function, there have been no studies to prove this. And so it's important to keep in mind that this trait actually could be just non-beneficial to the plant, as was concluded in the pleiotropy hypothesis. But more research is needed to determine the purpose of the occurrence of this toxic nectar. And that is the end of my presentation.
Which one do you think is the most? I mean, the Fidelity one is the one that I would lean towards automatically, but I don't know.
That was my thought as well. The antimicrobial hypothesis has broader implications though, and it doesn't necessarily limit it to like pollination interactions. And so I thought that could, at least for the ones containing the phenolic compounds, was a likely hypothesis for that.
I had a question.
Mhm.
And you may have said this, but I just want to double check. Were any of these pollens, sweeter or more attractive despite being as toxic as they are?
No, it has not been proven that they were more attractive as a result of the secondary compounds. So that's where the pleiotropy hypothesis becomes a lot more plausible, because it hasn't definitively been demonstrated that there is an adaptive quality to the toxic nectar.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? Looks like you did a great job to me.
Thank you.
Yeah, now you make me nervous to go.
Yes, I just have a comment. I was really surprised on your list of plants with toxic nectar. There's like begonias and beech trees and all kinds of plants that we're pretty commonly familiar with and didn't even realize that their nectar might be toxic to our pollinators. So
yeah, lilies, magnolias were on there. So a lot of stuff that you see in the Midwest.
I guess my question is then, ecologically, if they're going to kill off our pollinators, are they good to have around?
I would say yes and no, because it's only certain pollinators that this nectar is attracted to or toxic to. So some of them, could be visiting these plants and not have any adverse effects, whereas others certainly are. But I think it's a little give and take, just based on the fact that it's not always toxic to all individuals.
There's not one plant that's toxic to all of them, is there?
Correct, yes.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I can't say for sure. At least the ones that were listed in this study were not.
That makes sense. Thank you.
And even if they are, I mean, eventually that ends up a specialist evolves to resistance to it or something. I don't know about. I thought it was a good job. So anybody else have a comment or question before we move to the next speaker?
All right. Thank you guys.